The November fog that morning possessed that peculiar quality of London mist which transforms the familiar into the mysterious and the comfortable into the ominous. I had arrived at my friend Hercule Poirot's flat in Whitehaven Mansions to find him, as was his custom, engaged in one of those small rituals of order that seemed to provide him with the same satisfaction other men might derive from a fine brandy or an excellent cigar. He stood before his mantelpiece, contemplating with the intensity of a chess master the arrangement of 3 small porcelain figurines. With infinite care, he adjusted the position of a Dresden shepherdess by perhaps a quarter of an inch, stepped back to observe the effect, and nodded with the satisfaction of one who has restored harmony to a disordered universe. "Ah, Hastings," he said without turning, his hands smoothing his impeccable mustaches. "You arrive at the precise moment when perfection has been achieved. Observe the shepherdess. She now gazes upon her flock with the proper angle of benevolent authority. Before, she was merely looking. Now she sees." "I confess, Poirot, the distinction escapes me," I replied, settling into my accustomed chair. "A shepherdess is a shepherdess, surely." "Mon ami," he said, turning to face me with that expression of gentle reproach I knew so well, "it is precisely such thinking that allows the criminal to flourish. The difference between looking and seeing, it is everything. It is the difference between the ordinary mind and the mind of Hercule Poirot." He had begun to elaborate further on this theme when we were interrupted by hesitant tapping at the door. George, his invaluable valet, had stepped out on some errand, leaving us to answer the summons ourselves. The tapping came again, so soft and tentative that it might have been mistaken for the settling of old wood in the November damp. Poirot opened the door with that peculiar mixture of ceremony and curiosity that marked all his interactions with the unknown. Upon the threshold stood a young woman of perhaps 25 years, neatly dressed in the dark coat and modest hat of a lady's maid. Her gloved hands clutched a small leather purse, and her eyes, large, dark, and troubled, darted nervously between Poirot and myself. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice carrying the educated accent of one who had risen above her station through careful cultivation. "I'm sorry to disturb you, sir, but I was told, that is, I hoped, you might be able to help me." "But certainly, mademoiselle," Poirot replied, his voice taking on that tone of gentle authority that had a way of calming the most agitated spirits. "Please enter. I am Hercule Poirot, and this is my friend Captain Hastings, who possesses both discretion and sympathy in equal measure. You are in safe hands." She entered our sitting room with the careful steps of one unaccustomed to such surroundings, yet there was something in her bearing that suggested she had not always moved in humble circles. As she settled into the chair Poirot indicated, I caught the faint scent of lavender water, modest yet of good quality. "My name is Rose Pemberton," she began, then paused, as though the very act of speaking her name aloud in these circumstances required courage. "I'm in service to Lady Millicent Ashford in Grosvenor Square. I've been her personal maid for 3 years, and until recently I believed myself to be most fortunate in my position." "Until recently," Poirot prompted gently, settling himself in his chair with that bird-like attention that marked the beginning of his professional interest. "Yes, sir. You see, there have been incidents. Small things at first, items moved in Lady Ashford's room, letters that disappeared and then reappeared, conversations that stopped abruptly when I entered a room. I thought perhaps I was imagining things, but then—" She faltered, her hands twisting the handle of her purse. "3 days ago, I discovered something that I believe puts not only myself, but perhaps Lady Ashford herself in the gravest danger." Poirot leaned forward slightly, his green eyes fixed upon her face with that penetrating intensity that seemed to see beyond mere words. "And what, mademoiselle, did you discover?" Rose Pemberton drew a shaking breath. "I found a letter, sir, hidden in a book in Lady Ashford's private sitting room. It was not addressed to her, but to someone else entirely, someone who, according to the records, died 5 years ago. The letter spoke of debts that must be paid and of secrets that could destroy reputations. But most frightening of all, it mentioned a gathering that is to take place tomorrow evening, a dinner party at Lady Ashford's house. And you believe this gathering to be significant? I believe, sir, that someone intends to use this dinner party to settle these debts, and I fear that Lady Ashford, or perhaps one of her guests, may not survive the evening. The gravity in her voice was unmistakable, and I found myself leaning forward despite myself. Poirot, however, remained perfectly still, only his eyes betraying the rapid calculations taking place behind them. "This letter," he said at length, "you have it with you?" "No, sir. I was afraid to remove it, but I memorized every word." She closed her eyes briefly. It was signed with a single initial, M, and sealed with green wax. At the mention of green wax, Poirot's eyebrows rose almost imperceptibly. "Green, you say? An unusual choice." "Yes, sir, and there was something else. The paper, it was of the finest quality, with a watermark I recognized. It was the same stationery that Lady Ashford uses for her most private correspondence." "Ah," murmured Poirot, "and I knew that sound." It was the quiet exclamation of a man who has just seen the first piece of a complex puzzle fall into place. "And tell me, mademoiselle, who are the guests expected at this dinner party?" "Lady Ashford's nephew, Mr. Charles Ashford, who stands to inherit her fortune. Dr. Marcus Whitfield, who has been treating her for a nervous condition. Mrs. Evelyn Carstairs, her oldest friend and confidant. Mr. James Morrison, her solicitor, and," she hesitated, "and Mr. Anthony Marsh, a gentleman who has recently become a frequent visitor to the house." "A most interesting gathering," Poirot observed. "And you, mademoiselle, what is your role in tomorrow evening's entertainment?" "I am to serve at table, sir, as is customary when Lady Ashford entertains privately. But I confess, I am terrified. I feel as though I am walking into a trap. Yet I cannot abandon my mistress to face whatever danger awaits alone." Poirot was silent for a long moment, his fingers steepled before him in that characteristic pose of deep thought. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet confidence that had solved countless mysteries. "Mademoiselle Pemberton," he said, "you have come to the right man. Tomorrow evening, I believe, Hercule Poirot shall have the pleasure of dining at Lady Ashford's table, and you, ma petite, shall not face this danger alone." As Rose Pemberton departed, her step noticeably lighter than when she had arrived, I turned to my friend with curiosity written plain upon my face. "What do you make of it, Poirot?" I asked. He stood at the window, gazing out into the fog-shrouded street below. "I make of it, mon ami, that tomorrow evening we shall witness either the exposure of a most elaborate deception or the commission of a most carefully planned crime. The green wax, the carefully selected guests, the maid who discovers just enough to be dangerous. No, this is no coincidence. You think the girl is lying. I think, Hastings, that Mademoiselle Rose Pemberton knows far more than she has told us. Whether she is victim or accomplice remains to be seen. But of one thing I am certain. She possesses what our title suggests, a deadly secret. And tomorrow evening that secret shall be revealed." As the fog swirled outside our windows, I could not shake the feeling that we stood upon the threshold of one of those intricate puzzles that seemed to draw Hercule Poirot like a magnet draws iron. The maid with the deadly secret had knocked upon our door, and in doing so had set in motion events that would test even my friend's remarkable powers of deduction. The game, as they say, was afoot. The following morning found Poirot at his breakfast table, surrounded by neat sheets of paper covered with his precise handwriting. His preliminary inquiries into the Ashford household had yielded fascinating results. Lady Millicent's recent will changes, her nephew Charles's gambling debts, Dr. Whitfield's curious diagnosis of nervous exhaustion for symptoms that suggested something more sinister, and the mysterious Mr. Anthony Marsh, whose background dissolved under scrutiny like sugar in rain. "The stage is set, mon ami," Poirot announced as I joined him. "Tonight we dine with secrets." By evening, the November fog had lifted sufficiently to reveal Grosvenor Square in all its Georgian dignity. Lady Ashford's residence wore its serenity like armor, yet subtle signs betrayed underlying tension. A maid's hurried step, a footman's crooked collar, the nervous click of a door reconsidering itself. Lady Millicent received us in her morning room, handsome still in that way that had never permitted itself to be otherwise. Her eyes, bright and vigilant yet tired, assessed us with sharp intelligence. "Monsieur Poirot, you are kind to humor an old woman's concerns," she said. "I have had trifles, but I do not care for trifles." "Madame," Poirot replied with his characteristic bow, "to the ordered mind, trifles are signals. You expect trouble tonight." "I expect silence afterward," she returned cryptically. Rose Pemberton stood behind her mistress's chair, neat as a pin and pale as porcelain. Her gaze touched Poirot briefly before falling away, and he acknowledged her with the smallest nod. One musician recognizing another who knew the tune. The drawing-room had been transformed into a stage awaiting its performance. Charles Ashford lounged near the fireplace, examining a valuable landscape with the air of one appraising rather than admiring. His greeting to us was perfunctory, barely concealing his irritation. "I trust we won't find detectives under every napkin," he observed. "My aunt's nerves have grown theatrical." Dr. Marcus Whitfield arrived with clinical precision, his austere features and careful movements suggesting a man who diagnosed more than medical conditions. His pale eyes swept the room with professional assessment, lingering on Lady Millicent with an intensity that transcended mere medical concern. Mrs. Evelyn Carstairs sailed in like a ship in full regalia, enveloping Lady Millicent in silk and effusive greetings. Her voice held proprietorial warmth, but her eyes calculated, sifting through layers of shared history for useful morsels. "Millie obeys when orders sound like flattery," she announced cheerfully, "and never otherwise." Mr. James Morrison, the solicitor, embodied discretion incarnate. His dark suit, precise movements, and conversation limited to generalities masked watchful eyes that seemed to balance invisible ledgers. His briefcase, bound with green tape, never left his side. Anthony Marsh arrived last, smooth as varnish and twice as reflective. His signet ring bore a severe crest, his smile lingered past politeness, and his attention to Lady Millicent held an intimacy that 6 months' acquaintance hardly warranted. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, "we are honored. I hope you'll umpire fairly. I play only to win." "And by the rules?" Poirot inquired mildly. "Always," Marsh replied, which was not quite an answer. As we moved toward the dining room, Poirot's fingers lifted, quick and delicate, a stick of sealing wax from a brass tray. "Green." He replaced it as if it weighed, an ounce too much. "You dislike the color," I murmured. "I dislike all colors in excess," he replied. "And fashions that spread without taste. The green wax. It is nothing, and it may be everything. But my little gray cells do not chase the wax. They wait to see who stamps." The dining room gleamed like a stage before curtain rise. Place cards waited in strict order, and Poirot studied the arrangement like a general examining battle plans. With subtle precision, he adjusted Charles' chair by the smallest fraction. "You believe in angles?" I asked. "In angles of sight and of insult," he murmured. "A man contradicts more freely when he need not turn his head." Lady Millicent detained us at the threshold. "For months my letters have been tampered with," she confided. "If there is foolishness tonight, I shall stop it." "Then we dine on conversation, madame," Poirot assured her. "Permit that Miss Pemberton serves at my side. The eye tires less when it need not turn." As we prepared to take our places, Poirot offered his assessment. Charles is bored. The doctor fears a scene. Mrs. Carstairs enjoys one. The solicitor enjoys nothing, and Mr. Marsh enjoys himself. Lady Millicent refuses to be frightened, and that, mon ami, invites audacity. The players had assembled, each harboring secrets, each with motive. The deadly game was about to begin. The dinner commenced with the elaborate ceremony of a ritual, each course arriving with clockwork precision under Rose Pemberton's careful supervision. Yet beneath the veneer of civilized conversation, undercurrents of tension flowed like underground rivers, occasionally surfacing in a sharp glance or pause that lingered a heartbeat too long. Poirot had positioned himself strategically, his keen eyes absorbing every nuance as the guests settled into their roles. Charles Ashford attacked his soup with mechanical efficiency, his thoughts clearly elsewhere, while Dr. Whitfield barely touched his food, instead monitoring Lady Millicent with the intensity of a physician watching a critical patient. "You seem preoccupied tonight, Marcus," Lady Millicent observed, her voice carrying that particular edge of one testing waters. "I hope my constitution isn't providing undue concern." The doctor's fork paused midway to his mouth. "Not at all, Millicent, though these incidents you've mentioned do worry me. Perhaps we should discuss adjusting your treatment." "My mind requires no dulling, thank you," she replied crisply. "Recent events have sharpened my faculties considerably." Mrs. Carstairs leaned forward with the eagerness of one scenting gossip. "What sort of incidents, dear? You've been mysteriously evasive lately." "Have I?" Lady Millicent's gaze swept the table. "I find that the definition of friendship grows elastic with age, Evelyn. Sacred confidence becomes tomorrow's drawing-room entertainment." The barb struck home, and Mrs. Carstairs' smile faltered before reasserting itself with renewed brightness. Anthony Marsh, who had been listening with detached amusement, chose this moment to intervene. "Surely you don't suspect anyone at this table of harboring ill will? We are your most devoted admirers." "Devotion," Poirot murmured quietly to me, "is often indistinguishable from its opposite until the final act." As Rose served the fish course, her hands trembled almost imperceptibly. A drop of sauce fell beside Charles' plate, and he looked up sharply. "Clumsy girl. Can't you manage simple service?" "I beg your pardon, sir," Rose whispered, quickly dabbing the spot. "Leave it," Lady Millicent commanded, steel in her voice. "Rose has served faithfully for 3 years without complaint. I will not have her criticized for trifles." The defense seemed to galvanize the room's atmosphere. Mr. Morrison, largely silent until now, cleared his throat meaningfully. "Speaking of service, Millicent, have you reconsidered our recent discussions regarding your estate?" "Have you brought the documents?" she asked, as if expecting this. Morrison patted his briefcase, bound with green tape. "The changes you've requested are unusual. Perhaps we might discuss them privately after dinner." Charles' head snapped up with sudden attention. "Changes? What sort of changes?" "The sort concerning my property's disposition upon my death," his aunt replied coolly. "Surely you don't expect consultation while I'm still very much alive." "Of course not," Charles said quickly, but his knuckles whitened where they gripped his wineglass. A faint smear, the color of printer's ink, marked his cuff, a detail Poirot filed away with interest. As Rose refilled glasses, she whispered to Poirot so quietly only he could hear, "The letter has been moved, sir. Someone has been in Lady Millicent's sitting room." Poirot's expression didn't change, but his fingers drummed once against his napkin, a signal I recognized as the moment speculation crystallized into certainty. Mrs. Carstairs, perhaps sensing the need for distraction, launched into reminiscence. "Do you remember that poor fellow? What was his name? Who drowned off Sicily 5 years ago? Such a tragedy, then silence." "Michael Denham," Lady Millicent said levelly, though I caught the tightness beneath. "A tiresome business." "Ah," Poirot breathed, as if hearing a remembered melody. 5 years. An interval just long enough for grief to harden and debts to mature. Dr. Whitfield set down his knife. You romanticize, monsieur. Time is not a debtor's ledger. It is nothing else, Poirot replied quietly. It records and it collects. Anthony Marsh had grown very still during this exchange. When asked about his travels, he replied smoothly, Sicily once, if romance is required. How diverting, Mrs. Carstairs cried. Perhaps you knew Mr. Denham? Perhaps he met the water first, Marsh replied, not quite smiling. As dessert arrived, Lady Millicent made her announcement. I've arranged my affairs thoroughly. Mr. Morrison has seen to everything. No surprises for anyone. A palpable silence descended. Charles dropped his fork with a clatter, his face flushing crimson. Dr. Whitfield cleared his throat uncomfortably, while Mrs. Carstairs offered a strained smile. Marsh, however, merely raised an eyebrow, a faint smirk playing on his lips, as if he had anticipated this moment. Then the footman entered, bearing a green-sealed envelope. The game had begun in earnest. The footman approached with the deliberate steps of one bearing unwelcome news, the green-sealed envelope resting upon his silver salver like a serpent coiled to strike. The distinctive wax caught the candlelight with malevolent gleam, and I noticed how every eye at the table fixed upon it with varying degrees of recognition and dread. Lady Millicent received the correspondence with the composure of one who had been expecting this moment, though her fingers betrayed the slightest tremor as they broke the seal. The soft crack of wax seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence that had descended upon our gathering. She unfolded the single sheet within, and as her eyes moved across the lines, I watched her face transform from resignation to something approaching steel-edged resolve. It appears, she announced, setting the letter beside her plate with ceremonial precision, that someone believes I owe a debt, a very substantial debt, to be settled by midnight tonight, or else certain indiscretions regarding my late husband's business affairs will be made public knowledge. The effect was immediate and revealing. Charles Ashford's wine-glass trembled in his grip, a faint flush creeping up his neck that spoke of guilt rather than mere surprise. Dr. Whitfield leaned forward with professional concern, but his eyes held a calculating quality that suggested more than medical interest. Mrs. Carstairs gasped theatrically, yet her gaze darted immediately to Mr. Morrison, seeking some silent confirmation or denial. Indiscretions, Charles managed, his voice higher than usual. Surely you don't mean— I mean precisely what I say, Lady Millicent replied crisply. The letter demands £5,000 and threatens to expose certain irregularities in George's shipping investments. Investments that, if scrutinized, might prove embarrassing to several parties still living. Mr. Morrison adjusted his spectacles with legal precision. The sum is considerable, and the implications serious. May I examine the document? He extended his hand with professional authority, but I noticed how his briefcase, bound with green tape, seemed to press closer to his side. Anthony Marsh, who had remained silent throughout this exchange, finally spoke with that languid confidence that marked all his utterances. How fascinating that the past should choose this particular evening to present its bill. One might almost suspect orchestration. Poirot, who had been observing with the intensity of a naturalist studying rare specimens, now intervened with quiet authority. The letter, Lady Millicent. It bears no signature, I presume. None whatsoever. Only that distinctive green seal which I confess I've seen before. Her eyes swept the table meaningfully. Recently, in fact. Rose Pemberton, standing near the sideboard, went visibly pale at these words. Her hands, gripping a crystal decanter, began to shake so violently that I feared she might drop it. Poirot caught her distress immediately. "Mademoiselle Rose," he said gently, "perhaps you might serve the brandy. The evening grows complex and clarity of mind becomes essential." As she moved to comply, her trembling increased. The decanter slipped from her grasp, shattering against the marble hearth in a cascade of crystal and amber liquid. The crash seemed to release all the pent tension in the room. "Clumsy fool!" Charles exploded, his nerves finally snapping. "Can't you manage the simplest task?" But Poirot had moved swiftly to the broken glass, kneeling to examine the fragments with peculiar intensity. He lifted a shard to his nose, inhaled delicately, then looked up with an expression I knew well. The look of a man who has just confirmed a terrible suspicion. "Most illuminating," he murmured, rising with a piece of crystal in his palm. "The brandy, it carries an unusual aroma. Sweet like almonds, yet bitter beneath." Mademoiselle rose. "You have perhaps saved a life tonight." The implication struck like lightning. Dr. Whitfield's professional composure cracked entirely, while Mrs. Carstairs' fan snapped in her convulsive grip. Only Anthony Marsh remained seated, though his languid pose now seemed forced rather than natural. "You suggest poison," Morrison whispered, his legal training warring with human shock. "I suggest," Poirot replied, "that someone intended Lady Millicent's evening constitutional to be her last. The letter was merely the overture. The true performance was to be silent and final." Lady Millicent had risen, her dignity intact despite the revelation. "Then it seems the debt they speak of is not financial, but mortal. Someone at this table believes I deserve to die for my husband's sins." The accusation hung in the air like smoke, and I saw how each face revealed its owner's soul in that moment of naked truth. The maid with the deadly secret had just saved her mistress's life, but the evening's true revelations were only beginning. The acrid sweetness of almonds hung in the air like an accusation, and Poirot moved with the swift precision of a conductor taking control of a discordant orchestra. His voice, when it came, carried absolute authority that brooked no dissent. "No one leaves this room," he announced, his green eyes sweeping across each face with penetrating intensity. "The brandy, it tells us much but the faces. They tell us more. Rose, ma petite, you have perhaps saved not only Lady Millicent's life, but your own as well." The implication struck like lightning. Rose Pemberton, still trembling beside the shattered crystal, looked up with dawning comprehension. "My own, sir. But certainly. A maid who discovers poison by accident becomes a most inconvenient witness. No. Much simpler if she were to suffer a tragic fall down the servants' stairs, or perhaps succumb to the same nervous condition that has been troubling her mistress." Dr. Whitfield's professional composure cracked visibly. "That's a monstrous suggestion, Poirot. I would never—" "Never what, doctor? Never prescribe medications that might mask the symptoms of gradual poisoning. Never diagnose nervous exhaustion when the symptoms suggest something more sinister." Poirot's fingers drummed against his waistcoat. "Tell me, what precisely has been troubling Lady Millicent's constitution these past months?" The silence stretched taut as piano wire. Lady Millicent herself broke it, her voice steady as steel. "Nightmares, Monsieur Poirot. Dreams of drowning, of water closing over one's head. Dr. Whitfield attributed them to guilt over my husband's business dealings." "Guilt," Poirot mused, "or fear?" "Fear that the past would surface, like a body rising from the depths." His gaze fixed on Anthony Marsh, whose languid composure had begun to show hairline cracks. "You spoke earlier of Sicily, monsieur. A beautiful island, but treacherous waters for those who cannot swim." Marsh's hand moved involuntarily to his signet ring, and I caught the flash of recognition in Mrs. Carstairs' eyes. "You seem remarkably well informed about Sicilian geography, Monsieur Poirot." "I'm well informed about many things," Poirot replied smoothly. "For instance, I know that Michael Denham could swim like a fish. His drowning was unexpected." Charles Ashford's wine glass trembled in his grip. "What are you suggesting? That Uncle George had something to do with Denham's death?" "I suggest nothing. I observe. I note that Mr. Morrison's briefcase bears green tape, the same shade as our mysterious letter's seal. I observe that Dr. Whitfield recognizes the scent of almonds with suspicious alacrity. I note that Mrs. Carstairs knew of Mr. Denham's death before it was mentioned tonight. Mrs. Carstairs fluttered her fan nervously. It was common knowledge in our circle. Was it? Or was it common knowledge in a much smaller circle, those who were present when it occurred? Poirot moved to the mantelpiece, adjusting a figurine with characteristic precision. The letter speaks of debts, but debts come in many forms. Financial debts, moral debts, debts of blood. Mr. Morrison cleared his throat with legal precision. If you're suggesting that George Ashford was involved in some sort of conspiracy, I suggest that George Ashford discovered something that made him dangerous to someone in this room, just as Michael Denham discovered something that made him dangerous 5 years ago. Poirot's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. The question is not who killed Michael Denham. The question is who has been killing the Ashfords one by one ever since. The clock on the mantel chimed 10:30, and the sound seemed to galvanize the room. Rose Pemberton stepped forward, her earlier terror replaced by something approaching resolve. "There's something else," she said quietly. "Something I found in Lady Millicent's correspondence that I didn't mention before. A birth certificate hidden behind a photograph. It wasn't for anyone in the family." Lady Millicent's face had gone ashen. "Rose, no." "It was for Michael Denham," Rose continued, her voice gaining strength, "but the name on it wasn't Denham. It was Ashford. Michael Ashford." The revelation hit like a physical blow. Charles staggered backward, while Anthony Marsh's carefully constructed facade finally crumbled entirely. In the sudden silence that followed, I could hear the distant chiming of Big Ben marking the quarter hour. 15 minutes closer to midnight, and the deadly game was entering its final phase. The silence that followed Rose's revelation pressed down upon the dining room like a physical weight. The birth certificate, Michael Ashford, not Denham, had shifted the very foundation upon which the evening's deadly game was being played. Lady Millicent sat rigid in her chair, her aristocratic composure finally cracking to reveal the profound grief beneath. Charles Ashford was the first to break the suffocating quiet, his voice strangled with disbelief and rising panic. "That's impossible. I would have known if I had a cousin. Uncle George never mentioned any son, legitimate or otherwise." "Your Uncle George mentioned many things he later regretted," Lady Millicent replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Michael was his son from his first marriage, a marriage he preferred society to forget after he wed into respectability. The boy was sent abroad for his education and rarely returned to England." Mrs. Carstairs leaned forward with predatory interest, her earlier theatrical gasps replaced by calculating assessment. So the boy had legitimate claim to the Ashford fortune. How terribly inconvenient for everyone who believed themselves inheritors. Poirot moved with the precision of a master chess player, recognizing the moment when scattered pieces begin to form a pattern. "More than inconvenient, madame. Fatal, as events have proven. But the question that troubles my little grey cells is this. If Michael Ashford died in Sicily 5 years ago, who has been receiving correspondence addressed to him ever since?" The implication struck like lightning. Anthony Marsh, whose languid confidence had been his armor throughout the evening, now sat with the stillness of a predator calculating distances to escape routes. His hand moved involuntarily to his signet ring. The ring bearing what I now realized was the Ashford family crest. "You seem remarkably well informed about Sicilian waters, Monsieur Poirot," Marsh said, his voice maintaining its smooth cadence despite the tension radiating from his frame. "I am well informed about many things," Poirot replied, his green eyes fixed with laser intensity upon Marsh's face. "For instance, I know that Michael Ashford was an excellent swimmer. His drowning was unexpected to those who knew him well." Dr. Whitfield cleared his throat nervously. "The inquiry found no evidence of foul play." "The inquiry," Poirot interrupted gently, "did not know of Michael Ashford's true identity, nor of the powerful secrets he carried. Secrets that could destroy reputations and expose financial irregularities reaching into the highest echelons of London society. He moved to examine the shattered brandy decanter, lifting a fragment to catch the gaslight. The poison tonight was not random malice. It was the culmination of a 5-year campaign. First, the silencing of the one who held the most dangerous secrets. Then, the gradual deterioration of Lady Millicent's health, designed to appear as natural decline or nervous exhaustion. Rose Pemberton stepped forward, her earlier terror replaced by grim determination. "There's more, sir. In Lady Millicent's private papers, I found correspondence, letters that arrived monthly, always with that green seal. They weren't demands for money. They were reminders." "Reminders of what, ma petite?" "Of debts unpaid, of justice delayed." Her gaze swept the table, touching each face with accusatory precision. The letters spoke of a reckoning that would come when the time was right, when all the guilty parties could be gathered in one place. The clock chimed 10:45, and in its echo, I heard the approaching footsteps of revelation. Anthony Marsh's careful facade was beginning to show hairline cracks, while Charles's face had gone ashen with the realization that his expected inheritance might be built upon murder. Mr. Morrison clutched his briefcase closer, the green tape binding it now seeming less like professional efficiency and more like a noose waiting to tighten. "If you're suggesting some sort of conspiracy—" "I suggest," Poirot said quietly, "that someone in this room has been playing a very long game indeed. Someone who needed time to position themselves, to earn trust, to gather evidence of collective guilt." His gaze rested meaningfully on Anthony Marsh. "Someone who arrived in London precisely 6 months ago, shortly after Lady Millicent's solicitor began making inquiries about her late husband's first marriage." The net was closing, but the final revelation remained tantalizingly out of reach. The maid with the deadly secret had illuminated the darkness, but the true scope of the conspiracy and the identity of the master manipulator behind it all still lay hidden in the shadows of the past. As the clock's chimes faded into silence, I knew we stood upon the threshold of the final act in this deadly drama. The birth certificate's revelation hung in the air like smoke from a discharged pistol, and I watched as each face around the table processed the implications with varying degrees of shock and calculation. Charles Ashford had gone deathly pale, his wine-glass trembling in his grip, while Mrs. Carstairs' fan fluttered with the nervous energy of a trapped bird. "Michael Ashford," Lady Millicent repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "George's son from his first marriage. The boy, we were told, had taken his mother's name and wanted nothing to do with the family fortune." "A convenient fiction," Poirot observed, his green eyes moving systematically from face to face. "But fictions, like poorly constructed alibis, have a tendency to unravel when subjected to scrutiny." He moved with characteristic precision toward Dr. Whitfield. "Doctor, your medical bag, if you would be so kind." Whitfield's professional composure cracked visibly. "I hardly see how my medical supplies could be relevant to—" "Indulge me," Poirot interrupted gently, but his tone brooked no refusal. With obvious reluctance, the doctor produced his well-worn leather case. Poirot examined its contents with the methodical attention of a pharmacist conducting inventory. Among the usual implements of medical practice, his fingers paused over a small brown bottle bearing a chemist's precise label. "Hydrocyanic acid," he read aloud. "For diagnostic purposes, I presume." "Naturally. In minute quantities, it serves as a reagent for certain tests." "And in larger quantities?" Poirot's question hung in the air like an accusation. The silence that followed was broken by Rose Pemberton's quiet voice. "If I may, sir, there's something else." She moved to a mahogany writing desk in the corner of the room, her hands steady despite the tremor in her voice. "Lady Millicent's private correspondence desk. I noticed something peculiar when I was dusting yesterday." She opened the desk's leather-inlaid top, revealing neat compartments for paper, pens, and sealing materials. Poirot approached with the reverence of an archaeologist examining ancient artifacts. His fingers traced the edges of a stick of green sealing wax, noting the fresh nick along its surface. "Most illuminating," he murmured. "The wax has been used recently, yet Lady Millicent has not sent any correspondence requiring such formality in weeks." His gaze swept the assembled company. Someone has been making use of this desk, someone with intimate knowledge of its contents and easy access to this room. Anthony Marsh, who had maintained his languid composure throughout the evening's revelations, now showed the first signs of strain. His hand moved involuntarily toward his signet ring, and I caught the flash of recognition in his eyes as they fixed upon the green wax. "You seem troubled, Monsieur Marsh," Poirot observed with deceptive mildness. "Merely fascinated by your methods," Marsh replied, but his voice lacked its earlier, smooth confidence. "Though I confess, I fail to see how sealing wax and medical supplies constitute evidence of murder." "Ah, but you see only the instruments, monsieur. I see the orchestra." Poirot moved to examine the writing paper in the desk, holding a sheet to the gaslight. "The watermark. It is distinctive. The same paper used for the threatening letter our dear Rose discovered. Curious, non, that a blackmailer would choose such expensive stationery." Mr. Morrison cleared his throat with legal precision. "Perhaps we should summon the authorities. These accusations are not accusations, monsieur, but observations." Poirot's interruption was gentle but firm. "Though I confess, the pattern becomes increasingly clear. Someone with access to this house, to Lady Millicent's private papers, to her correspondence materials, has been conducting a most elaborate campaign." The clock in the hallway chimed 11 o'clock, and the sound seemed to galvanize the room's atmosphere. Rose Pemberton stepped forward, her earlier terror replaced by grim determination. "There's something more, sir. Something I found in the servants' quarters." She produced a small leather journal from her apron pocket. It belonged to Mary Hutchins, the previous lady's maid. She left rather suddenly 6 months ago, just before Mr. Marsh began visiting regularly. Poirot accepted the journal with careful hands, his eyes scanning the neat entries with rapid intensity. Most enlightening. Miss Hutchins writes of strange visitors, of correspondence that arrived and disappeared, of conversations overheard in the study late at night. He looked up, his gaze fixing on Anthony Marsh with laser precision. She also writes of a gentleman who bore a remarkable resemblance to a portrait in Lady Millicent's private sitting room, a portrait of her late husband's first wife and her young son. The net was closing, but Anthony Marsh's facade, though strained, remained intact. "Resemblances are common enough, Monsieur Poirot. Surely you don't base accusations on such flimsy evidence?" "I base nothing on single threads, monsieur. But when threads weave together into a pattern—" Poirot moved to the mantelpiece, adjusting a figurine with characteristic precision. "The pattern speaks of patience, of careful planning, of someone who needed time to position themselves within this household's trust." As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed from the corridor outside, heavy, measured steps that spoke of official authority. Poirot smiled with quiet satisfaction. "Ah, I believe our evening's entertainment is about to enter its final act." The door opened to admit Inspector Japp, his weathered face grave with purpose. Behind him stood 2 constables, their presence transforming the elegant dining room into something resembling a courtroom awaiting judgment. The game was approaching its climax, but the final revelation, the complete unmasking of the truth, behind 5 years of deception and tonight's attempted murder, still lay ahead as the clock moved inexorably toward midnight. Inspector Japp's arrival transformed the elegant dining room into an impromptu courtroom, his weathered features surveying the scene with the practiced eye of a man who had witnessed humanity's capacity for deception in all its myriad forms. The 2 constables flanked the doorway with military precision, their presence eliminating any possibility of flight while lending an air of official gravity to the proceedings. "Evening, Poirot," Japp said, his voice carrying the weight of Scotland Yard's authority. "Your message suggested urgency. Something about attempted murder and a conspiracy spanning years? Indeed, mon ami, Poirot replied, gesturing toward the shattered crystal that glittered like accusations across the Persian carpet. Though I confess the evening has proven even more illuminating than anticipated. The poison was merely tonight's finale. The true performance began 5 years ago in the waters off Sicily. Anthony Marsh had risen from his chair with fluid grace, but his movement toward the French windows was smoothly intercepted by one of the constables. For the first time that evening, his languid composure showed genuine hairline cracks, though his voice remained steady. Surely this is premature, Inspector. No actual crime has been committed. Has it not? Poirot's eyebrows rose with theatrical surprise. The systematic intimidation through threatening letters, the gradual poisoning of Lady Millicent's constitution, tonight's attempted murder, these constitute no crimes in your estimation. Japp's attention fixed on the small brown bottle still visible in Dr. Whitfield's medical case. Hydrocyanic acid, Doctor. Rather specialized for a house call, wouldn't you say? Whitfield's professional composure cracked visibly. A diagnostic reagent, Inspector, used in minute quantities for certain medical tests. I had nothing to do with that brandy. The brandy tells us much, Poirot observed, moving to examine the shattered decanter with characteristic precision. But the faces, they tell us more. Each of you will now provide a sample of your handwriting. A single sentence. The debt is due at midnight. Nothing more. He distributed paper and pens with methodical care, watching each face as they complied. Mrs. Carstairs wrote with bold, looping strokes. Charles scrawled hastily, blotting ink with nervous energy. Whitfield produced neat, measured characters. Morrison printed with legal precision before switching to cramped cursive. Anthony Marsh took his time, creating something coolly continental in its elegance. As Poirot gathered the sheets, his eyes lingered for just a fraction on one sample, a faint green smear near the upper margin, so subtle it might have been dismissed as shadow. He tucked the papers away without comment, but I caught the satisfied gleam in his green eyes. The gaslight flickered suddenly, casting dancing shadows across the assembled faces. Japp jerked his head at the nearest constable. "Blasted draft. Keep those sconces steady." The light dipped again. Once, twice, then failed entirely for 3 heartbeats that seemed to stretch into eternity. In the sudden darkness came a soft cry, the whisper of silk against wood, the distinct click of a latch engaging. When illumination returned, Morrison stood rigid beside the table, his briefcase gaping open to reveal its contents. Nestled among the legal folders lay a narrow envelope, sealed with unmistakable green wax. "That was not there a moment ago," Morrison stammered, his face pale with shock and dawning comprehension. Japp's expression hardened with professional suspicion. "Well, well, convenient timing, wouldn't you say?" Poirot lifted the envelope with delicate fingers, as one might handle a venomous insect. The seal bore no device, merely plain green wax pressed smooth. He broke it carefully, extracting a single sheet of familiar watermarked paper bearing 5 words in an impersonal hand. "Midnight. The codicil is void." "Codicil?" Morrison's voice cracked with strain. Lady Millicent's eyes sharpened with understanding. "The recent changes to my will." "Been playing games with her papers, have you?" Japp demanded, but Poirot raised a restraining hand. "This letter was not written by a lawyer, mon ami. It is theatre, a carefully planted prop designed to incriminate the man most obviously associated with Green." His gaze swept toward the service door. The latch clicked. Someone stepped into the corridor during a moment of darkness. He moved to the high oak screen that concealed the servants' entrance, pressing against a panel that gave inward on silent springs. The narrow passage beyond smelled faintly of candle wax and old wood. Within, on a low shelf, lay the evidence of hasty preparation. A stick of wax, shaved at the edge, a cheap pen, violet ink, and a scrap of blotting paper stained green. "The maid?" Japp muttered, but Poirot's expression remained thoughtful. "Mademoiselle Rose has small hands, as did Mary Hutchins before her. But those who serve are not the only ones who pass through servants' ways." He lifted the blotting paper to examine it more closely. "This wax, it carries the scent of pine resin, cheaper than the lavender-scented variety used exclusively by the Ashford household." A shout from the corridor shattered the tense atmosphere. The second constable burst through the doorway, his face flushed with exertion. "Inspector, the morning room! Window's been forced!" They rushed through the corridors, footsteps echoing against marble and oak. The morning room presented a scene of calculated chaos. Overturned chairs, papers scattered across the carpet, and the tall sash window hanging open to admit the November fog. On the windowsill, a smear of green wax gleamed like a fresh wound. Lady Millicent crossed swiftly to the window, years seeming to drop away with the momentum of fear. "Rose! Rose, where are you?" Only silence answered, broken by the soft hiss of fog pressing against the glass. Poirot knelt at the sill, his fingers tracing the wax residue with scientific precision. He lifted the tiniest flake and examined it with the delight of a botanist discovering a rare specimen. "Most interesting. This is not the Ashford wax." "Green is green," Japp protested, but Poirot shook his head. "Non, mon ami. The Ashford wax is scented with lavender, a discreet luxury. This carries pine resin, favored by stationers in Bloomsbury." He rose, brushing his hands with characteristic fastidiousness. "Our conspirator brings his own materials to the masquerade. Careful in all things, except when hurried by circumstance." Lady Millicent gripped the back of a chair, her aristocratic composure finally showing cracks. "She's gone. Rose is gone." "Not gone," Poirot corrected quietly, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "Removed, and not by the person you might expect." His gaze swept the assembled company, noting how each face revealed its owner's soul in this moment of crisis. "We have 30 minutes until midnight, time enough to end a game that has been 5 years in the making." The clock's chimes seemed to echo with ominous finality as the fog swirled beyond the violated window. The maid with the deadly secret had vanished, but whether as victim or conspirator remained the crucial question that would determine whether justice or tragedy would claim the final act of this elaborate drama. The fog that had shrouded Grosvenor Square began to thin as the clock approached 11:30, revealing patches of gas-lit pavement like islands emerging from a grey sea. Within Lady Millicent's morning room, the violated window stood as mute testimony to the evening's escalating violence, while the assembled company waited with the taut expectancy of actors awaiting their cue. Poirot stood motionless at the windowsill, his green eyes fixed upon the smear of green wax that had hardened in the November cold. With characteristic precision, he lifted the tiniest fragment and held it to the gaslight, inhaling delicately as one might sample a rare vintage. "Most illuminating," he murmured, his voice carrying that quiet satisfaction I'd learned to recognize as the moment when scattered pieces began forming a coherent pattern. "This wax, it tells a story of deception within deception. The Ashford household uses lavender-scented wax exclusively, a small luxury, but distinctive. This specimen, however, carries the sharp scent of pine resin, favored by stationers in Bloomsbury." Inspector Japp, who had been directing the search through the garden with military efficiency, looked up sharply. "You're saying someone brought their own materials?" "Précisément. Someone who needed to stage Rose's disappearance but was unprepared for the specific details of this household's customs." Poirot moved with bird-like quickness to examine the Persian carpet near the window. "Observe the footprints, mon ami. Not the delicate impressions of a lady's maid, but the substantial marks of expensive leather soles. Savile Row quality, I would venture." The implications struck like lightning. Charles Ashford's face went ashen while Dr. Whitfield cleared his throat with nervous precision. Mrs. Carstairs had abandoned her theatrical gasps in favor of sharp-eyed calculation, her gaze moving from face to face as if working out odds at a gaming table. Only Anthony Marsh remained seated, his languid pose intact despite the mounting evidence. Yet I noticed how his fingers had begun drumming against his thigh with increasing frequency, and how his eyes never quite met Poirot's penetrating gaze directly. "The window was opened from within," Poirot continued, his voice taking on that professorial tone that marked his most crucial deductions. "The scratches on the brass fittings tell us this clearly, but the question that has troubled my little grey cells is this: did Mademoiselle Rose open it to escape, or to admit someone she trusted?" Lady Millicent moved closer, her aristocratic features drawn with worry. "Rose would never betray this household. She has been utterly loyal for 3 years. Indeed, madame, which is precisely why she became dangerous to someone who had been using that loyalty as a weapon." Poirot's gaze swept the assembled company with laser intensity. "Someone who needed access to your private papers, your correspondence, your most intimate household routines. Someone who could move freely through these rooms without arousing suspicion." The clock in the hallway chimed the half-hour, its bronze voice echoing through the house like a funeral bell. 30 minutes remained until midnight, the deadline that had haunted the evening's correspondence. From the garden came the sound of returning footsteps, and one of Japp's constables appeared at the window, his face grim with failure. "No sign of her, Inspector, but we found evidence of a struggle near the ornamental pond. Footprints, torn fabric, signs of a confrontation." Poirot nodded as if this confirmed his expectations. "The fabric, Constable. Describe it, if you please." "Fine wool, sir. Dark blue, expensive quality. Caught on a rose bush near the water's edge." "Ah." Poirot's exclamation was soft, but loaded with significance. His gaze moved deliberately around the room, noting the clothing of each suspect with scientific precision. Dark blue wool of excellent quality. Rather specific, would you not agree? Anthony Marsh shifted slightly in his chair, and I caught the almost imperceptible adjustment of his jacket, a movement designed to conceal rather than reveal. But Poirot's eagle eyes had already catalogued every detail. "The birth certificate that Rose discovered," Poirot said suddenly, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "It revealed that Michael Denham was actually Michael Ashford, George's son from his first marriage. A young man supposedly drowned in Sicily 5 years ago." "We've established that," Charles said impatiently, his nerves clearly fraying. "But what does it matter now? The man is dead." "Is he?" Poirot's question hung in the air like smoke from a discharged pistol. "Or is he perhaps sitting in this very room, having spent 5 years carefully constructing a new identity and positioning himself within this household's trust?" The silence that followed was deafening. Every eye turned toward Anthony Marsh, whose languid composure finally began showing hairline cracks. His hand moved involuntarily to his signet ring, the ring bearing what I now realized was the Ashford family crest. "You seem remarkably well informed about Sicilian waters, Monsieur Marsh," Poirot observed with deceptive mildness, "and about the specific details of this household's routines. The lavender-scented wax, the particular brand of brandy Lady Millicent favors, even the location of her private correspondence desk." Marsh's smile, when it came, was cold and humorless. "Coincidence, surely. A frequent visitor learns such details naturally." "Does he? Even details known only to family members and the most trusted servants?" Poirot moved to the mantelpiece, adjusting a figurine with characteristic precision. "Rose Pemberton possessed what our evening's title suggests, a deadly secret. Not her own secret, but yours, Monsieur Michael Ashford." The revelation struck like lightning. Mrs. Carstairs gasped audibly, while Dr. Whitfield's professional composure cracked entirely. Charles Ashford stared with his mouth agape, the implications of a living cousin devastating his inheritance expectations. Anthony Marsh, or rather Michael Ashford, rose from his chair with fluid grace, but his movement toward the door was smoothly intercepted by Japp's positioning. "Clever deduction, Monsieur Poirot. But where is your proof?" "The proof lies in the details you overlooked in your careful performance," Poirot replied, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "The green wax you used for tonight's theatrical correspondence, pine-scented rather than lavender. The intimate knowledge of family secrets that only a true Ashford would possess. The signet ring bearing your family's crest, worn openly yet explained away as coincidence." The clock moved inexorably toward midnight, and with each passing moment, the net of evidence tightened around the man who had spent 5 years orchestrating an elaborate campaign of revenge and reclamation. "But most damning of all," Poirot continued, "is the fact that Rose recognized you. Not immediately, perhaps, but gradually, as she compared your features to the family portraits in Lady Millicent's private sitting room. She knew you were no Anthony Marsh, but Michael Ashford returned from the dead." The game was approaching its climax, but the most crucial question remained unanswered. Where was Rose Pemberton, and would the next 15 minutes bring justice or tragedy to the final act of this deadly masquerade? The revelation hung in the air like smoke from a discharged pistol, but Poirot raised a restraining hand as Inspector Japp moved toward Michael Ashford. "Un moment, mon ami. The identity of our returned prodigal son is but one thread in this tapestry of deception. The immediate question remains. Where is Mademoiselle Rose?" Michael's carefully constructed facade finally began to crack, his languid pose abandoned as he calculated distances to potential escape routes. Yet something in his expression suggested not guilt, but genuine confusion. "I had nothing to do with the girl's disappearance. My quarrel was never with servants." "Indeed." Poirot's eyebrows rose with characteristic skepticism. "Then perhaps you will explain the torn fabric found near the ornamental pond. Midnight blue wool of Savile Row quality?" "My jacket was torn during our earlier confrontation in the corridor," Michael replied smoothly, "when the lights failed and someone jostled past me in the darkness. I assumed it was one of your theatrical arrangements, Monsieur Poirot." The Belgian detective's green eyes sharpened with interest. "Theatrical arrangements? You suggest someone else orchestrated tonight's little drama of darkness and misdirection?" Before Michael could respond, Poirot moved with characteristic precision toward the servants' corridor, his voice carrying absolute authority. "Hastings, Inspector Japp, we fetch our missing witness. The truth awaits in the conservatory." The glass-walled sanctuary at the garden's edge crouched like a sleeping beast, its panes beaded with November's chill. Inside, shadows of exotic palms etched the floor in intricate patterns, while the air carried the heavy scent of hothouse blooms and something else, something medicinal and sharp. Poirot's keen eyes traced a path across the damp flagstones, noting droplets that had splashed in a pattern he read as easily as a railway timetable. "2 persons," he murmured. "One dragging, one resisting. But observe, Hastings, the footprints tell a story of professional precision. In the adjoining potting shed, we found Rose Pemberton bound to a wooden chair, her wrists secured with rope tied in a distinctive pattern. Her eyes, wide above a cloth gag, flooded with relief at our arrival. "Courage, ma petite," Poirot soothed, cutting her bonds with surgical precision. His fingers examined the knots with scientific interest. "The double throw, a surgeon's knot. Not the handiwork of our theatrical Monsieur Ashford, I think." Rose coughed delicately as the gag was removed, her voice barely above a whisper. "It wasn't Mr. Marsh. I mean Mr. Ashford. He arrived after I was already bound. Someone else brought me here, someone who spoke softly, like a physician calming a patient." Poirot's expression sharpened with the satisfaction of a puzzle piece sliding into place. "And this person, Mademoiselle, did you notice any distinctive scents? Any particular mannerisms?" His hands were very steady, sir, and gentle despite the circumstances. There was a bitter smell about his coat. Carbolic, I think. and when he spoke, it was with the quiet authority of one accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Dr. Whitfield," I breathed, the implications striking like lightning. "Précisément, mon ami." Poirot helped Rose to her feet, his voice carrying grim certainty. "Our good doctor has been playing a deeper game than mere medical attendance. The hydrocyanic acid in his bag, the intimate knowledge of Lady Millicent's routines, the professional skill with knots and restraints, all point to a man who saw opportunity in another's campaign of psychological torment." As we returned to the house, Rose walking steadily between us, Poirot continued his analysis. Michael Ashford returned from his staged death to reclaim his birthright through intimidation and fear. But Dr. Whitfield recognized the perfect cover for a more direct approach. Murder disguised as the culmination of a blackmail scheme. The morning room awaited our return like a stage set for the final act. The assembled company turned as one, their faces reflecting varying degrees of relief, calculation, and growing dread. Dr. Whitfield's professional composure cracked visibly as his gaze fell upon Rose's unharmed figure. "Two conspiracies," Poirot announced, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "One seeking justice through terror, the other seeking profit through murder." Michael Ashford's campaign of psychological warfare provided the perfect camouflage for Dr. Whitfield's more direct methods. The clock in the hallway began its solemn approach to midnight, each chime marking the final moments of an elaborate deception that had spanned 5 years and culminated in tonight's deadly masquerade. The brandy was poisoned not by our returned heir, but by the man trusted with Lady Millicent's medical care, Poirot continued, his gaze fixed upon Whitfield's increasingly pale countenance. A man who stood to inherit substantially under the terms of her current will, terms he helped influence through his diagnosis of her declining mental state. As Big Ben's bronze voice began tolling midnight across fog-shrouded London, Poirot straightened his waistcoat with characteristic precision. "Mesdames et messieurs, the hour of revelation has arrived. Let us gather for the final accounting of debts both moral and mortal." The game was entering its ultimate phase, but the complete unraveling of 5 years' worth of deception and tonight's attempted murder awaited the methodical brilliance of Hercule Poirot's final exposition. The bronze voice of Big Ben finished tolling midnight as we reconvened in the drawing room, the assembled company arranged like actors recalled to the stage for the final act. Inspector Japp positioned himself by the door with military precision, his constables flanking the exits, while Lady Millicent resumed her chair with a composure that owed more to aristocratic will than to ease. Rose Pemberton, pale but resolute, stood near the mantelpiece, no longer the trembling maid who had knocked upon our door, but a witness whose courage had prevented tragedy. Michael Ashford, no longer bothering with the Anthony Marsh masquerade, watched Poirot with the calculated stillness of a predator held carefully in check. Dr. Whitfield's face bore the thin sheen of a man who had rehearsed every explanation, yet found the script had been changed entirely. "Bon," Poirot said softly, his voice carrying that quiet authority which had unraveled countless mysteries. "Now we bring order to chaos. Mesdames et messieurs, tonight we have witnessed not one conspiracy, but 2, each feeding upon the other like serpents consuming their own tails." He moved to the mantelpiece, adjusting a figurine with characteristic precision before continuing. The first, a campaign of psychological warfare spanning 5 years, conceived in bitterness and executed with meticulous patience. The second, a cold calculation of murder, hidden beneath the cloak of the first and using it as perfect camouflage. His green eyes fixed upon Michael with laser intensity. "You, monsieur, are no Anthony Marsh. You are Michael Ashford, son of Lady Millicent's late husband from his first marriage, believed drowned 5 years ago off the coast of Sicily. Your death was carefully orchestrated, staged with the assistance of local fishermen after you discovered the true nature of your father's shipping investments." Michael's languid pose had vanished entirely, replaced by rigid defiance. My father's business partners were thieves and murderers. They deserved to face justice. Justice, perhaps, Poirot replied with gentle reproach. But your methods were those of terrorism, not justice. The monthly letters with green seals, the gradual escalation of threats, the careful cultivation of Lady Millicent's trust under your false identity, all designed to create an atmosphere of fear that would force her hand in amending her will. He lifted the stick of sealing wax from the desk, examining it like a piece of evidence. Your choice of pine resin wax from a Bloomsbury stationer, rather than the Ashford household's distinctive lavender-scented variety, was a small yet telling oversight in an otherwise meticulously planned campaign. Mrs. Carstairs fluttered her fan nervously. But surely the boy had legitimate grievances. Grievances, yes, Poirot acknowledged. But observe the supreme irony, madame. While Michael orchestrated his campaign of psychological torment, another predator moved within the very circle of trust he sought to manipulate. His gaze shifted to Dr. Whitfield with the precision of a surgeon's blade. Dr. Marcus Whitfield saw in Michael's activities the perfect opportunity to eliminate Lady Millicent and claim his substantial bequest under her current will. For months, you have been treating Lady Millicent for a nervous condition, a diagnosis that served perfectly to mask the true nature of her ailment: slow, insidious poisoning. The doctor's professional composure cracked like thin ice. This is preposterous. I have served Lady Millicent faithfully. Faithfully. Poirot's interruption carried the sharp edge of moral outrage. You prescribed sedatives that masked the effects of small doses of toxins. You positioned yourself as the concerned physician while systematically undermining your patient's health and mental clarity. The hydrocyanic acid in your medical bag, not a diagnostic reagent, but an agent of death that, in minute quantities, mimics the symptoms of anxiety and nervous decline. Inspector Japp stepped forward, his weathered features grim. The brandy decanter, doctor. Enough poison to kill, disguised as the tragic culmination of months of declining health. Rose stepped forward, her voice steady despite the magnitude of her revelation. I discovered the doctor's true intentions 3 days ago, sir. I found correspondence in his coat pocket, letters to a solicitor in Brighton, inquiring about probate processes for substantial medical bequests. Poirot nodded approvingly. Mademoiselle Rose has been most thorough in documenting your activities, doctor. The times of your visits, the medications you prescribed, the questions about Lady Millicent's financial arrangements. Most damning of all, your inquiries about the specific effects of various toxins when administered in small, regular doses. He moved to examine the shattered crystal fragments. Tonight, your plan accelerated. The threatening letter, placed by Michael during our theatrical moment of darkness, was merely the overture. Your true intention was to administer a fatal dose through Lady Millicent's customary evening brandy. When Rose dropped the decanter, she saved not only her mistress's life, but perhaps her own. For a maid who had discovered family secrets and witnessed attempted murder would become a most inconvenient witness. Dr. Whitfield's hands trembled as the net of evidence tightened. You have no proof. On the contrary, Poirot interrupted, producing Rose's small leather notebook. The surgeon's knots used to bind Rose in the conservatory. The carbolic scent she noted on your coat, your professional precision in handling both poison and restraints, all speak to your medical training turned to murderous purpose. Lady Millicent's voice, when it came, carried the steel of aristocratic authority tempered by profound betrayal. You would have murdered me for money, Marcus. Money I trusted you to help me manage wisely for charitable purposes. The irony is complete, Poirot observed with grim satisfaction. Michael's campaign of terror, designed to expose corruption and reclaim his birthright, instead provided cover for the very sort of mercenary murder he claimed to oppose. 2 conspiracies, each enabling the other, creating a web of deception that required the most careful untangling. As Inspector Japp moved forward with handcuffs, Dr. Whitfield's shoulders sagged in defeat. "You do not understand. She would have been comfortable. No pain." "Ah," murmured Poirot with sudden severity. "Murder made tidy. I prefer life disordered to death organized." The constables led the doctor away as silence settled over the room like dust after a storm. Lady Millicent looked directly at Michael, her nephew revealed. "And you? What justice do you seek now?" He met her gaze squarely, the pretense finally abandoned. "I will answer for my methods, but I will not vanish again. The Ashford name deserves better than the shadows it has inhabited." Poirot smoothed his mustaches, his voice gentle now that justice had been served. "There remains, madame, only the apportioning of truth. The law will take the doctor. For Monsieur Michael, there is another tribunal entirely. Family." Lady Millicent rose with dignity and tact despite the evening's revelations. "Tomorrow we shall speak of the future. Tonight is done, and with it, 5 years of shadows." As the clock chimed the quarter hour past midnight, Poirot straightened his waistcoat with characteristic precision. The maid with the deadly secret, he concluded, was neither victim nor accomplice, but the guardian angel whose courage and observational skills prevented a perfect murder from achieving its goal. Order has been restored from chaos, and the truth, like a persistent flower, has finally broken through the pavement of lies. The deadly masquerade had ended, but from its ashes, the possibility of genuine family reconciliation and justice properly served had emerged. A fitting conclusion to one of the most complex deceptions Hercule Poirot had ever unraveled.